Hi, I'm here today to tell you a story that to me is a most wonderful example of how God can look after his people. He doesn't always save people when they ask him, and we don't always know the reason why, but I'm one of those who are blessed to be able to give a testimony today of God's wonderful power in my life. This story happened a few years ago now, but I was president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Western Pacific area, and I lived in Honiara in the Solomon Islands. Part of my territory was in Vanuatu, and on this particular occasion my wife and I had gone to the northern part of Vanuatu, to the area of Santo, and we'd been conducting some meetings there. On late or early Saturday night, just after sunset, I was to fly back down to Port Vila in order to catch a plane the next day to come back to Sydney. My wife stayed behind. I'll tell you more about that later and why she did that. But I was able to hop onto this small plane, a twin otter plane. It carried about 18 people. And on this night there were about 12 people, including the pilot, who was seated in this plane. He took off quite unusually because the pilot didn't say anything to us. He didn't welcome us aboard or do anything else. But we just accepted that, and the plane took off toward Port Vila, about 55 minutes to an hour away. It was fine weather when we started off, but after a while a storm came up, and as it got darker we could see lightning flashing, and the rain was beating on the windows of the little plane. There was a lot of turbulence. It got quite rough, and I remember tightening my seatbelt and thinking that I'll tell my colleague down in Port Vila when I get there that this was the worst plane flight I'd ever had, because it was quite rough. Well, we kept going for some time until we should have landed, and some of us as passengers were looking at our watches and wondering what had happened, whether we were lost or gone past where we should have been. We weren't quite sure. The pilot, of course, did not say a thing, and we began to get a little bit anxious, wondering whether he was lost or whether we were heading into just complete blackness and he couldn't see where he was going. So I remember beginning to pray and just thinking of my wife and children and asking God to watch over them and help us through this desperate situation. After a little while, the pilot roared the engines up full throttle, and there's a couple of explanations you could think of. Maybe it was that he was about to land and was a little bit low and needed to put some more power on to come to the right altitude to land. Or another one was, that crossed my mind, perhaps he's seen a mountain come in front of him and he's roaring the engines to try and get out of the way. Well, that lasted only for about 5 seconds, maybe 10, and then suddenly the engines cut and it was complete silence. And in that short time, my mind went racing, thinking of, all right, we're going to hit something soon. And I began to brace myself. I wasn't sure whether we were going to crash into a mountain and that would be the end of it, or what was going to happen. A couple of seconds after that silence, we suddenly heard a bang and we were thrown forward, and immediately the door between the cockpit and the cabin burst open and water started flowing up the aisles. Probably in about 5 seconds or less, the water was up to my knees, and it was like a nightmare. We're all in shock and realised that instead of hitting a mountain, we'd actually landed in the ocean. At that moment, I struggled to try and get my life jacket or my life belt or seat belt off, and the man and his wife in front of me and the man just across near the door, they opened the door and jumped out, and I was able to jump out next. And eventually, out of the 12, 8 people were able to get out of the plane. It was dark, it was stormy, the rain was pouring down, the waves were rough, and lightning was still flashing. It was a horrendous situation. People were screaming. I tried to get up onto the wing. In fact, I did get up onto the wing of the plane, which by this stage was almost at water level because the plane was half under the water. I took off my shoes and some of my clothes that would have weighed me down and realised that I'd probably have to swim. It was a terrible thing to see. After about 2 minutes, the plane began to move and it started to sink down under the ocean into the dark depths. I remember calling out to some people who are still around near the door of the plane, try and get some life jackets, please. And unfortunately, only 2 life jackets were brought out of the plane, and 2 people got them. I wasn't able to get a life jacket. But we saw the plane go down, and the little light on the back of the plane just going down into the darkness until it disappeared. And I realised then that there's no one there to help us. The pilot hadn't got out. There was no flight attendant on such a small flight. And so here we were, about 8 people. There was screaming, there was darkness, we could hardly see a thing. And I remember crying out in the darkness. I think the Lord must have put it on my heart. So I just cried out and said, I'm a pastor, I'd like to pray for us. Now remember, I didn't know anyone on this flight. I didn't know who was a Christian, who wasn't. But God impressed me to pray, and I called out above the waves as high as I could, and the waves were hitting me in the face, and the wind was howling, and the rain was pouring down, and it was a chaotic situation. But I just prayed a short prayer as loud as I could that God would care for us, and I heard someone in the darkness say, yes, amen. So I thought maybe there was one Christian amongst them. To cut a long story short, it was going to be a long night ahead. I mentioned that there were 2 life jackets. One went to a man from Scandinavia, another one went to a local Vanuatuan man, and unfortunately his life jacket would not blow up, so I had to blow it up by my mouth, and then the ties to it didn't work, and the whistle didn't work, but fortunately it had a little light on the shoulder, and that was the only light we had. The other man had a life jacket that was able to be fitted well, but didn't have any light. So that's the only light we had in this completely dark night, except for one positive thing, and that was that miles away in front of us we could see the twinkling lights of Port Vila, the capital of Vanuatu. We found out later that we had probably crashed about 10 to 13 kilometres from Port Vila. So we realised that we had to start swimming. We couldn't just stay there, and we basically decided amongst ourselves to try and stay in a little group and keep close to the light that was from the one light jacket, and we'd swim slowly toward the lights of Port Vila. 2 other men who got out of the plane with us did not come with us for some reason. We don't know what happened to them. They obviously didn't survive. But 6 of us started out swimming. One man from England, he was an anthropologist. He had been injured in the actual crash itself, and after about an hour he slipped off into the darkness, and I called out to him, try and hang on, you've got as much chance as the rest of us of being rescued, because we thought at that stage that someone would surely come and try and find us once they found out that the plane had not landed. But so that was sad. He was lost at that time, and then there was 5 of us left. We kept swimming and trying to encourage each other, keep going, don't give up, those sorts of things, and swam toward these lights that we saw in the distance. Unfortunately, we were swimming against a current, and we didn't seem to be making much progress at all. Maybe we were, but in the darkness and at sea level at night, it's hard to judge distance. But we felt we were swimming against the current, and we swam for several hours before we thought that we weren't making much progress. We realised then that no one was going to come and look for us. I remember looking at the lights of Port Vila and saying, why doesn't someone come? But we found out later why, and I'll explain that a little later. After about 3 hours, I was cramped, and I was starting to get really cold. I was being bitten on the legs by some sea creatures, probably just stingers. But even before that, I had thought about sharks, because this area is notorious for sharks. And I was almost going to say something to the others about, I hope there's no sharks here, or something like that. But I believe God put it into my mind just to keep quiet, and I didn't say it. And I praise God, because after that, for the rest of the time we're in the water, it never even entered my head. I would have got scared and probably panicked if I had thought about sharks too much, but I never thought about them again, so I'm very grateful for that. After, as I say, 3 to 4 hours, I was almost at my end. I couldn't keep going. I'd swallowed a lot of salt water, It rained from time to time, and I'd put my head back and open my mouth and get some water on my tongue, fresh water. But I was cramping in my arms and my legs. I was starting to shiver in the cold. And at that stage, I remember calling out to the others that, look, we're in a bad situation if we don't make it. However, we don't have to fear, because God has promised us that if we trust in Jesus, we can have eternal life. I had used a couple of these texts that day in a sermon, actually. They came to my mind, and I thought, well, who knows what's going to happen to us tonight? This may be the only opportunity these people have of hearing about Jesus. And so then we went on a little bit longer, and I was getting tired, and everyone else was slowing down a bit too. And I really didn't think we were going to make it. I thought maybe God's not going to answer our prayer this time. I didn't lose my trust in Him. I still trusted Him. I didn't fear death. And the assurance of salvation was very real to me. I'd often wondered how I'd be in a situation like that. But I can thank God that I had the confidence that no matter what happened, I'd be raised up at the resurrection and be able to see Jesus face to face. And that was a wonderful comfort to me. So I lay on my back for a little while, just kicking my legs to not drift too far away from the others, remembering that I didn't have a life jacket. And I was seriously considering just diving under and giving up, because I felt I'd never make it. And just at that point of time, when I was at my desperate end of what I could do, right above me for the first time in the night, the only time in the night, the clouds parted and a bright star shone straight above me. There'd been no moon, there'd been no stars before this, it was just blackness. And apart from the little light on the life jacket. And just at that point, when I saw that star for about 5 to 10 seconds and then the clouds closed over, I just sensed that God was revealing to me that I'm not alone. He could see from heaven. Some might say it's a coincidence, but I believe it was providential, and it gave me fresh courage and fresh faith to keep moving on. And I prayed to God, look, if you have something for me to do, please give me the strength to keep going. And I thank Him, because He did give me strength to keep going for quite some time further. So after that I kept swimming. I got back to the group, and we kept encouraging each other a little bit. But by this time we were all very tired, and all seriously wondering how things were going to finish up. We swam on for about another hour, I guess it was. By this time we'd been in the water about 5 hours, 4.5 to 5 hours. I still had my watch on, and I could see just by a little bit of luminescence in it that roughly what the time was. I kept swimming, and then while I was swimming and still getting tireder and swallowing more salt water and aching all over, I began to think, my mind went back to things that had happened in the days before this. In fact, when we had arrived in the Solomon Islands about 18 months before, actually on the flight out, my wife had been reading a Bible, and she had marked a little passage. I've got it right here, I'll just read it to you. It was quite interesting when we look back on it later. It said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. And when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned." And it goes on promising that God would look after His people. And it's just interesting that text came back to me as I was swimming there in the darkness. And what had happened even the next day when we arrived in Honiara, we were taken around the place, shown the place, and I was being driven in a 4-wheel drive with my wife through the town of Honiara. And we got out into the outskirts of the town, and it was, I guess, doing about 60, 70 kilometres an hour, and suddenly the steering broke. And straight away the 4-wheel drive was swerving in and around buses and trucks and cars coming toward us, and I just cried out and prayed, "Lord, save us." And amazingly, the vehicle just veered in between these other vehicles and went across and slid alongside a fence on the side of the main road. Well, that was the first one. That was the first day we arrived there. I didn't think too much about that at the time. And then some months later, my daughter actually came out, and my wife and daughter and I went down in a borrowed 4-wheel drive down the coast to some meetings and a baptism on a Sabbath afternoon. And on the way back, there's one strip of road that is quite good, very rare in the Solomons. And I was travelling about 90 kilometres an hour, and suddenly the back right wheel seized up. And it was very difficult to control the car. It was kind of sliding and twisting sideways, and a truck was coming toward us quite close, full of copra or coconuts. And again, I just cried out in faith to God to save us. And the vehicle swerved right across to the left side of the road into some long grass, almost tipped over, but then straightened. We couldn't start it, it wouldn't move, it was locked, the wheels were locked. So the truck driver fortunately stopped. He came and brought a chain, and he attached the chain and pulled us out onto the road. I just prayed again, the car started, and we were able to move. We drove all the way back normally to Honiara, and the next day the mechanics checked the vehicle and couldn't see any reason why that back wheel would have seized. Some months later, I was over in Papua New Guinea attending some board meetings, was taken out by car to the airport. We came to a T-junction. The driver looked to the right and turned to the left and didn't look to the left. And I could see this truck coming right for us, and he was headed toward it. I just called out, "Look out!" And he swung, and we just tipped the side mirrors of this bus, or truck was it, I can't remember, one of the two, and the vehicle I was in. A split second, and we would have been killed. So while I was in the water thinking of what was happening, it all came back to me, and I realised and believe to this day that this was part of a spiritual battle going on. I believe that God was wanting me to be there for a special purpose, but Satan was trying to destroy my ministry, not because of me, but because of who I represented. I represented God's church, and there were things that were happening both in the Solomons and in Vanuatu that were trying to affect our ministry and our mission. In the Solomons, there was a spiritualistic group that was trying to get rid of Christianity and Western civilization, and miracles were happening under the power of Satan, and some of our church members in those rural areas were being influenced by that. At the same time, there was an ethnic conflict going on in the Solomon Islands, and our church was in the middle of trying to bring reconciliation, and we're facing a lot of difficulties with that. In Vanuatu itself, our church has been criticised by a break-off group who were saying we were apostate and God had left us, and some of our members were being swayed by those arguments. As I thought of all this, I just sensed that this was Satan's way of trying to destroy God's church, and if I had died in their area, according to their customs, they would have been so ashamed and so embarrassed, and they would have also had their faith really tested. So I remember just raising my face up to the sky, and I laugh at this now, but I shook my fist up and I said, "Satan, you get out of the way. Jesus is stronger than you are, and he's going to get us to shore." And I then prayed, "God, give your people something to praise you for, not to be discouraged about." And I knew that people would be praying for me there in Port Vila. I knew that even in Australia, the message probably would have got back and people would be praying. And in the Solomon Islands, and I found out, of course, that was true. Special prayer meetings have been called, and I could sense that people were praying for me. So that gave me fresh courage, and I just kept swimming and kept encouraging with the others as well. So eventually, after about 5 hours, 5.25 or 5.5 hours, somewhere there, we saw two lights. We had obviously come inside a big bay with Port Vila straight ahead. And we saw these two lights, one little light on the right, one on the left. And I wondered which way should we go to try and get out of the current and swim to closest shore, because we were still a long way from Port Vila. And I remember praying, "Lord, please show us which is the quickest way, which is the best." And I said to the others, "Which way do you think we should go?" And they all said the same as what I was impressed to say, to the little light. And we found out later that if we'd gone to the left light, we would have got into a notorious current, would have taken us around a point called Devil's Point, which is famous for its sharks and rough seas and rock and so forth. And I just thank God that he again gave us all a unanimous answer, go to the little light. So we turned and we got out of the current eventually and began to make way toward this little light. After a little while longer, probably another half an hour, we could just see a light grey strip, which we interpreted as a beach. And then we could hear some waves. And I began to think, oh no, I'm going to get cut up and tossed around on the reef. And maybe my bare feet I'd stand on a poisonous fish, and all these negative thoughts came to me. But then God made me think differently, and I said to myself, who cares? I don't mind if I'm wrapped in bandages for a month as long as I make it to shore. So we got closer to shore, and eventually were able to find that the reef was calm. There was no rough water there, and we were able to drag ourselves up eventually onto the shore. At that stage we just collapsed, and after a bit of time of recovery, we all stood up, and I called them together, and we put our arms around each other, and we just thanked God. And I asked him to help us to remember the resolutions that we probably would have made in that time. I know I'd made some. I'd said, Lord, please help me in the future to praise you more. Loosen my lips that I might praise you more. Help me to be more loving and expressive of my love to my family, and some of these things. And I guess others had made resolutions too as they faced the possibility of death. We then left the beach and walked up toward this little light. And it turned out to be a man who was living in a sea container. He'd set up his home in the sea container. And we knocked on the door at about 1:45 in the morning. This is almost 6.5 hours after the plane had crashed. And I was there bedraggled and probably white as a ghost, and wet and looked tired and exhausted, and the others were too. He opened the door, he woke up, and he let us in. He gave us some hot drinks and some food, and some warm, dry clothes, and had a telephone. I was able to ring up our mission headquarters and also the police and ambulance and notify people that we were safe. When the ambulance finally came, they took us into hospital for observation overnight, or for the rest of the night, and we had x-rays and so forth. Fortunately, I only had some cuts on my leg and possibly a cracked rib, but I was wrapped in blankets, warm blankets, for more than 4 hours before I stopped shivering. I was very close to being really hypothermic, and I realise now that I couldn't have lasted very much longer at all. Some people might think, well, you know, anyone can swim for a few hours if they have to. I wasn't a good swimmer. I'd never swum more than 100 metres before, and to swim without being able to stop for a second or to touch anything or put your feet on the sand below or whatever, it's very different from just swimming in a swimming pool and being able to have a rest when you want to. And I was in my early 50s at that stage, so I wasn't young. And for me, as I look back on it, I am really confident that I only survived because of God's power and through the power of prayer. I'm really convinced of that. I'm here today, I believe, only because of God and his saving power. And I'm quite confident to share my testimony about that with anyone, because I don't believe that I could have made it. In fact, I almost didn't make it, as I said before. If I hadn't have seen that star, I would have drowned. Perhaps I should just tell you what happened immediately prior to our plane flight. I had hurt my back quite severely on my preparation to go up to Santo to take meetings. My wife was with me, and she was to take some meetings as well. And I was almost complaining to God that why would this happen when I could hardly stand up, and I was in pain and trying to preach and walk around the place and talk with people, and it was very, very uncomfortable. But that's really what helped save me, because when I got onto the plane that night, I sat right across from the door where you enter at the back of the plane. Normally I would have sat right down the front. I always used to sit down the front. But because of the pain in my back, I just flopped into the closest seat I could, tightened my seatbelt as hard as I could, and that's the only reason I'm here today, because the people down the front, unfortunately, never made it out, including the pilot and the passengers right down close to the cockpit. So that was one thing that I look back on now and say, well, look, God can even spoil Satan's plans, and God can see in advance what's going to happen. My wife was supposed to be with me on that flight, but when we got there, they had changed the program, and they wanted her to stay back the next morning to take some meetings. It was Mother's Day the next morning, and they wanted a special meeting for the women and asked her if she would stay back, and she decided to stay back. And that was very unusual for her. She would never normally do that. When I was leaving her on her own, that wouldn't normally happen. But I praise God that that did happen, because she would have found it very difficult. She's not a strong woman physically, and maybe we would have both gone down trying to save each other. So I thank God for that happened. When we were in the water and I was wondering why people didn't come, it was not till later that we found out what had happened. I've already explained why I thought Satan was trying to attack us on that night. But what happened was that someone had reported to the authorities that there was an explosion or a crash up in the mountains. And so the ambulance and police and so forth had gone in the darkness up into the mountains, searched through the jungle, trying to find this plane crash. And about 3 hours after the crash, the Australian High Commissioner and also the Chief of Police came to our mission headquarters and told our people there that unfortunately the plane had been found and there were no survivors. I don't know how that happened, but the story got to them, and that's what they came and told our leaders there. Now I thank God too that they didn't tell my wife that. She knew that the plane was missing, but she was trying to be as calm and positive as possible, and they decided not to ring up and tell her this news. And I'm glad that happened, because she was spared that thought of definitely thinking that I was dead. Why people didn't come to rescue us was, one, because they'd gone to the wrong place or thought the plane had crashed in the mountains. But also even later, the authorities decided to send out the one patrol boat that they have there in Vanuatu, and so they tried to contact the captain, and his phone wouldn't work. And then eventually they got someone to contact him, and then his car wouldn't start. And then he tried to make contact with his second in charge and other crew members, and their phones were out, and so nothing would work. And it was several hours before they actually got their crew together, sat down, had a meeting, and decided to come and look for us. By that time we'd actually already been ashore for over an hour. So to me this is almost a comedy of errors, some might think. All things were against us, and I only believe that's because of God that we are here today and that I can tell this story to you. So there's other things I could perhaps add to this, but I want to thank God and praise Him. He is a wonderful God. He doesn't always save. We know that. We are in a universal war. There are casualties. But from time to time God steps in and tells us that He's still in control. He has the power to turn the worst circumstances into good. And I believe He did that this night. So thank you for hearing my story. I hope it gives you courage and faith. Put your trust in God, and we don't have to fear death if we are close to Jesus. We can have confidence that no matter what happens to us. As I thought that night, if I close my eyes in death tonight, the next thing I will see is the coming of Jesus. And that assurance can be yours too. And I hope it is. Thank you.